One of you students in Philadelphia bought me this shirt, and it says, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." That quote is attributed to a guy named Frederick Douglass, who fought for the abolition of slavery. And after the abolition of slavery, he fought for African Americans' rights in the period after the Civil War, known as Reconstruction. Arguably, that struggle is still going on, and it's important for you to know, one, what was Reconstruction all about, and two, understand the continued struggle and fight for rights of not just African Americans, but everybody in this government of ours. And that's the whole point of the last month of class, is that you will be learning about a particular topic in uh, United States government history. So for today, it is a reading quiz. I didn't tell you about it because I want to see what you know without any um, prep work at all. So this test that you're about to take is going to be 57 questions, seven of which are coming from an article which I will read to you. It's a collection of two, actually, about Reconstruction. And the next 50 questions are about just what we've learned in class, some basic knowledge of how our government works. I'm going to use that test to kind of put you in teams for the rest of the year to become an expert in a topic in our government's history. And more importantly, teaching you how to improve it. Because if there's one thing that you can learn from Reconstruction, is that the good guys might win, but it is a continued fight. It is a continued struggle to make our government better. So, without further ado, I should have given you the um, code to get in. I would download the article, which is titled Reconstruction, Congressional Reconstruction, and Need to Knows for Reconstruction. So here we go. Let me zoom in here. Well, let's get going. Congressional Reconstruction. When Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency in April 1865, he took charge of the nation's Reconstruction Plan. Under Johnson's plan, white Southerners were allowed to elect ex-Confederate officers to Congress and to new state legislatures. In addition, those new state governments wrote black codes that restricted the rights of Black Americans. Northern legislators condemned those actions. They refused to readmit Southern states under Johnson's plan. But Congress was left with a problem. How could it protect Black Americans without punishing white ex-Confederates to such a degree that they would hate the United States forever? The first Civil Rights Act. In April 1866, overriding Johnson's veto, Congress passed the nation's first Civil Rights Act. It protected the rights of Black Americans as citizens of the United States. It also gave Black people equal access to the legal system. But a group of radical Republicans in Congress believed they needed to do something more permanent. Their determination to abolish slavery had been accomplished when the states ratified the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. To guarantee the civil rights of Black Americans, Congress decided that another constitutional amendment was needed. In June of 1866, Congress sent the 14th Amendment to the states for ratification. The 14th Amendment declared that Black people were American citizens. It said that no state could take their life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. The amendment prohibited any ex-Confederate who had sworn before the war to protect the United States Constitution from holding political office. That meant that most of the new state officers elected under Johnson's plan were ineligible. The amendment also tried to encourage Southern states to support Black suffrage. Congress warned that a state's congressional representation would be reduced if Black men were kept from voting. Southern white people were outraged, and Johnson supported them. He urged them not to ratify the 14th Amendment. He said that the Republicans would be swept out of power in the 1866 congressional elections. When that happened, Southern states could return to the Union under his more generous plan. Only Tennessee, Johnson's home state, ignored him. Its legislators passed the amendment. On July 24th, 1866, it became the first former Confederate state to be readmitted to the Union. Meanwhile, angry white people in the other Southern states turned on Black Americans. During the summer of 1866, white mobs led race riots in Memphis and New Orleans. They killed more than 80 Black people. The radical Republicans, and that is just a description of the picture above. The radical Republicans. Horrified by the violence in the South, voters backed Congress that fall in the 1866 congressional elections. They gave Republicans more than 2/3 of the seats in the House of Representatives. That enabled Republicans to make sweeping changes as they took control of the nation's Reconstruction. The radical Republicans had the votes to pass legislation without the president's approval, and they did just that. On March 2nd, 1867, Congress overrode another veto to pass the Military Reconstruction Act. This landmark piece of legislation divided the 10 unreconstructed former Confederate states into 5 military districts. Each district was overseen by former Union military commanders. The act mandated the Southern states write new state constitutions. Ex-Confederates prohibited from holding office under the terms of the 14th Amendment could not vote for delegates to the constitutional conventions. All other men, both white and Black, could. Once elected, the delegates to the new constitutional conventions were required to establish new state governments that guaranteed Black suffrage and ratified the 14th Amendment. When those requirements were met, Southern states could apply to Congress for readmission. Under those conditions, Southern states refused to start enrolling voters. They preferred to remain under military control rather than allow Black men to exercise their right to vote. White Southerners' refusal to participate forced Congress to pass 3 more Reconstruction Acts, 2 in 1867 and 1 in 1868. The Military Reconstruction Act. The U.S. military took over voter registration in the South, and formerly enslaved Black men enrolled, mostly as Republicans. Their interest in political issues and making informed choices were pointed to as proof that they were good citizens. The delegates elected under the Reconstruction Acts wrote moderate and reasonable constitutions. Those drafts guaranteed the right to vote to all men. They also provided for taxation to support schools and other public services new to Southern states. The majority of voters in 7 Southern states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and South Carolina, adopted their new state constitutions and elected new state legislatures. After they ratified the 14th Amendment, those 7 states were readmitted to the Union by June 1868. Georgia later was returned to military rule when its state legislature expelled its Black American legislators. A year after its initial passage, the Military Reconstruction Act seemed to be a success. And in February 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified. It gave Black men the right to vote. Between 1867 and 1877, Black people and their white male allies voted hundreds of Black lawmakers into office in the South. In 1870, the first Black men were elected to U.S. Congress. 2 men served in the Senate. 14 men won seats in the House of Representatives. Several black men served as state lieutenant governors. Black men also served as sheriffs, judges, marshals, and justices of the peace. In those offices and many other appointed positions, they protected the rights of formerly enslaved people. Political power, through the right to vote, made a difference in formerly enslaved people's lives for a time, but it did not last. As the military officers enforcing Reconstruction in the South left in the 1870s, Southerners reasserted control at the state levels. Black Americans saw their new freedoms rolled back, leading the way. Black Americans were not quiet bystanders to their fates in the South. In November 1865, in Charleston, South Carolina, 2,000 Black Americans drew up a petition. They wrote, "We simply ask that we shall be recognized as men, that there be no obstructions placed in our way, that the same laws that govern white men shall govern black men, that we have the right of trial by a jury of our peers, that schools be established for education of colored children as well as white, and that the advantage of both colors shall, in this respect, be equal." In the spring of 1867, Black voters participated in political rallies. They registered and voted in huge numbers. Formerly enslaved people also engaged in civil disobedience against discrimination. 3 formerly enslaved people sat in a whites only section of a segregated streetcar in Richmond, Virginia. In New Orleans, formerly enslaved people attempted to seize white streetcars in an effort to end segregation. For a time, public transportation was desegregated in that city. The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction. As a result, Democrats regained power in the South. They failed to fulfill promises to protect the rights of Black people. By the turn of the 20th century, a new racial system was established in the South. And that racial system we now know as the Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow South. Now for 5 things everyone should know about Reconstruction. And this is written by a teacher educator. So when I became a teacher, I didn't just, use my history degree, walk up to Mr. Mattern and say, "Hey, I've got a history degree, let me teach." No, you got to get licensed by the state. So this person, Tiffany Mitchell Patterson, is an assistant professor of secondary social studies. So the people that train people like me. 5 things everyone should know about Reconstruction. And this is in her words. So when it says I, it's her, it's not me. I'll never forget the students' response. I was in a middle school social studies class and asked the students what they knew about Black history. "Martin Luther King freed the slaves," the student said. "Martin Luther King Jr. was born in 1929. That's more than 6 decades after the time of enslavement." To me, this comment showed how closely Americans associate Black history with slavery. While shocked, I knew this mistaken belief reflected the lack of time, depth, and breadth schools devote to Black history. Most students get limited information and context about what African Americans have experienced since our ancestors arrived in the United States 4 centuries ago. Without independent study, most adults don't know either. For instance, what do you know about Reconstruction? If you're like most Americans, young and old, you probably don't know much. I used to teach social studies, and now I prepare social studies teachers for the classroom. I consider understanding what happened during Reconstruction essential for exploring Black power, resilience, and excellence. During that complex period after the Civil War, African Americans gained political power, yet faced the backlash of white supremacy and racial violence. I share the concerns many writers, historians, and other scholars are raising about the shortcomings of what school children normally learn about Reconstruction in school. Here are some suggestions for learning more about that time period. Number one, the Reconstruction Amendments gave new rights and powers. The US government passed three constitutional amendments that extended civil and political rights to newly freed African Americans following the Civil War. The 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. It banned slavery and involuntary servitude except for the punishment of a crime. The 14th Amendment was ratified 3 years later. It granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born in the United States, as well as naturalized citizens, including all previously enslaved individuals. Then the 15th Amendment asserted neither the federal government nor state governments could deny voting rights to any male citizen. Number two, African American politicians were influential and brave. These changes to the Constitution made it possible for African American men to use their newfound political power to gain representation. This is often missed in history and social studies classes. Hiram Rhodes Revels was the first African American senator. He represented Mississippi in 1870 after the state Senate elected him. He was among the 16 Black men from 7 Southern states who served in Congress during Reconstruction. Revels and his colleagues were only part of the story. All told, about 2,000 African Americans held public office at some level of government during Reconstruction. If it wasn't for the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote to all men, these leaders would not have made it to a public office. African American men had a new power, and that was to choose who would make decisions in the nation's government. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan formed during the Civil War. They grew in popularity during Reconstruction in opposition to African Americans gaining new rights and powers. These terrorist groups used violence and threats to intimidate African Americans, people of color, Black voters, and legislators. This made the accomplishments of African American politicians even more impressive. They served as public officials under the constant threat of racial violence. Black women activists fueled Reconstruction. Black women technically gained the right to vote in 1920 when the 19th Amendment passed. However, their constitutional right was limited in many states due to discriminatory laws. Many Black women were activists and women's suffrage movement leaders. They fought for equal rights and dignity for all. They did this through public speaking, prolific writing, and developing organizations dedicated to racial and gender equality. There's a boss there, is Mary Church Darrell. There were many Black women activists during Reconstruction. The 5 Rollins sisters of South Carolina who fought for female voting rights. Maria Stewart, an outspoken abolitionist before the Civil War and suffragist once it ended. A suffragist is somebody who, at the time, fought for women's rights. Mary Ann Shadd Curry, the first Black woman in North America to edit and publish a newspaper, one of the first Black female lawyers in the country, and an advocate for granting women the right to vote. Ida B. Wells, journalist and civil rights advocate who raised awareness of lynching. Lynching is hanging somebody. Mary Church Terrell, founder of the National Association of Colored Women. Point number 4. Higher education was prized as a key to success. Before the Civil War, many states made teaching enslaved individuals to read a crime. Education quickly became a top priority for Black Americans once slavery ended. Learning to read, write, and do a skilled trade was essential for earning a good living. Still the same now. Education is also essential for learning about the world and participating in helping make it a better place. Some northern, largely white philanthropists and missionary groups in the United States Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands helped to create new educational opportunities. But the African American public schools established after the Civil War were built and staffed mostly by the Black community. Many new institutions of higher education began to operate during Reconstruction. Many of these are still in operation today. They are now called historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs. These schools trained Black people to become teachers and ministers, doctors and nurses. They also prepared African Americans for careers in industrial and agricultural fields. Some public and private HBCUs founded during Reconstruction and still operating today include Howard University in Washington, D.C., Hampton University in Virginia, Alabama State University, Morehouse College in Georgia, Morgan State University in Maryland. These colleges and universities train a disproportionate share of Black doctors and other professionals even today. Number 5, and this is for me the most important, Reconstruction was an incomplete transition. As the renowned Black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois observed, racist laws and violent tactics in many states actively limited Black freedom. The slave went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward slavery, he explained. This was not by choice. White supremacists were intimidated and threatened by Black freedom and excellence. They attempted to enforce subordination through violence, such as lynching. They also did this in systematic ways through Jim Crow laws. African Americans continued to assert their civil and constitutional rights as activists, politicians, business owners, teachers, and farmers in the midst of white supremacist backlash. Today, voter suppression efforts that try to stop access to the ballot box for voters of color and the resurgence of racist violence and vitriol. Du Bois' words sound eerily familiar. At the same time, it's reassuring to recall how quickly formerly enslaved African Americans made their way to schoolhouses and public offices. And that's the thing. The struggle is still there, not just for Black Americans, but for every single American. It's so easy to sit back and do nothing. The world is great. You've got your TikToks, your video games that make life present and pleasant. And what we always forget is that if we want something from our government, or if we want some sort of change, we have to learn how to act. And that's the point of this week. This week, you're going to start the process of becoming an expert in a particular topic on American history. And the next 50 questions, after you answer the 7 article-based ones, are going to give you a little bit of a taste for what those topics are. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. So for the last month of school, I hope you struggle so you can progress. Good luck.